Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Get Brandt's Rants. So first of all, I promised myself that I would do a much shorter video. So let's see if I can actually hold myself to that. But so there's two things that I really wanted to talk about because I was almost feeling a little bit like almost personally trolled by international news this in the last couple days, because there's two articles that just came out, and I'll as I post this, I'll make sure that I link both of those articles on the website so that people can read them. But so the first one was actually by The Guardian, which is a British source, but I actually enjoy getting international news because I trust it a lot more than a lot of U.S. sources. But anyway, so The Guardian had just posted an article about Colombia, the country, not any of the cities in the U.S. or anything. So Colombia, a lot of people don't know really much about it politically. Even though it borders on Venezuela, and so all the Republicans, of course, are like, Venezuela. And, of course, it's right next to Colombia, which, again, is part of the reason why they should talk about Colombia, because Colombia, the two have a political and economic and military situation that is very much intertwined, and that's a problem. And people talk about a lot of the kind of extortion and everything, and in fact, this article does actually refer to that a little bit. So again, I like the fact that in doing these videos, I get to talk to people and everything else. Please remember, I do have a website with this, and I actually like the written stuff better. First of all, it's easier to present and edit and put the right information in, whereas my videos, I'm just kind of talking, and if I misspeak and whatever, if I can't edit it out, I'm just kind of stuck with it. So I'm still getting used to these videos, but we'll get there. Anyway, so the official headline of this Guardian article should already tell you something, and it says Colombian death squads exploiting coronavirus lockdown to kill activists. So the reason I kind of take this a little bit with a personal thing is because of the fact that it's actually about 20 years ago now. It was roughly around 2000, and I'm sure other people will be able to kind of put that together a little bit more easily. But I had taken part in a civil disobedience action where I was arrested, specifically associated with Colombia and specifically U.S. military aid to Colombia. So I'll tell you about that situation because, again, if I was willing to get arrested for it, I really want to talk about it and raise awareness, even if it was 20 years ago. Because guess what? Apparently it's still relevant. So what happened? So Colombia it has been engaged in a very long-term civil war. And so the FARC is the kind of left-wing rebels who have been fighting for like 40 years, and just because they're left-wing, I don't want to say like, oh yay, the FARC, because violence is violence, extortion is extortion, illegal drug cartels, etc., etc. No fun on the left or the right. So the right-wing death squads and the right-wing paramilitaries, because paramilitaries are paramilitaries, whether they're left-wing or right-wing, but the right-wing paramilitaries, for the most part, were actually So part of it, number one, if you've ever heard of the School of the Americas or WINSEC, I consider them the real life Hydra. They're an organization or school in the United States that basically trains. So whenever it was called the School of the Americas, and there was actually a lot of left-wing activism that helped shut it down, which it obviously didn't shut it down. They just changed the name and made it harder to get Freedom of Information Act requests to actually see what they were doing and report on it. Anyway, so they basically would train people in, at the time, what was called counterinsurgency tactics, which that's kind of a dog whistle or code to me. Again, like the easiest analogy I could say is whenever people said like counterinsurgency tactics, they might as well be saying Hail Hydra. It's basically how do you prevent a popular uprising within a country, which in the United States, I really wish we would have more popular uprising. Anyway, what the sponsors of a lot of these right-wing death squads are such familiar figures as Coca-Cola Company and United Fruit. So anyway, oh yes, Coca-Cola Company sponsors death squads in Latin America, especially in Colombia, but you know, here and there, wherever they have factories. So if you've ever worked at Coca-Cola, especially in Georgia, where they had all their manufacturing facilities before they outsourced them to somewhere else, they probably outsourced them to Colombia. And why? Because it was cheaper to hire right-wing death squads to murder union organizers than it was to pay you a living wage in the United States. So that's where, number one, whenever people talk about globalization, that's kind of the cyclical process that was happening, is that it's not just a thing of, because a lot of laborers especially really have hard feelings about unions because of the fact that a lot of companies in the United States, once they unionized, the company closed down shop and then outsourced to another country. And whenever we talk about the trade deals and everything else that make it easier for companies to outsource internationally, we kind of almost never used to talk about, well, I say we, some of us talked about it constantly, and you called us all conspiracy theorists until, you know, now. Well, you're still probably calling me conspiracy theorist, but but anyway. So what didn't get into the public consciousness is that all of these there's a lot of violence and international violence that was accompanying these moves towards international outsourcing. And so that's a big issue, and it's a big problem, and it's been a big problem for at least 40 years in the case of Colombia. So with all the coronavirus lockdowns and everything else, some of these right-wing death squads are like, hey, now we know everybody's going to be home. And so in the article, it reports on at least 3 deaths that have taken place of very high-profile activists in Colombia during this coronavirus outbreak. So I don't want to talk too long about the specifics. Again, you know, The Guardian did good reporting on it, and you know, feel free to read the article. The main thing is, it's just so I was going to say, you know, the 20 years ago action. So Colombia, being that right-wing organization, to give some background, the United States actually has laws on the books that we cannot or will not give international military aid to any country that does not meet a certain minimum standard of human rights, which is great, except that it's been so long on the books that like nobody ever actually pays attention to it, except in certain cases. So with the kind of military industrial complex that we also complain about a lot, there was in Connecticut, where I lived at the time, particularly in Shelton, around the Shelton kind of Stratford line, is a company called Sikorsky Aircraft, and Sikorsky Aircraft builds Black Hawk helicopters, and people may recognize those from such popular movies as Black Hawk Down, where we heroize them. So Black Hawk helicopters have been used by the Colombian military to fight against the FARC and everything else. And so, again, in Colombia, you basically have three different factions, constantly fighting against each other. So you have the FARC on the far left. You have these right-wing paramilitaries, basically sponsored by Coca-Cola, on the right, and then you have the Colombian government in the middle being like, what? And nobody's a good actor here. There's no heroes. I mean, there are heroes. They're just all getting shot. So, Colombian government not supporting human rights in general. So, in order to give $13 billion, over $13 billion in helicopters for free to the Colombian military, the United States Congress actually had voted to bypass the rules requiring, and this was Democrats and Republicans. Actually, there was way too many Democrats had voted for it. Again, we had I don't know if it was a Democratic majority, but the Democrats had a lot more power than they have right now at the time. So it's part of this whole thing where people very often in the United States tend to be like, oh well, the Democrats aren't perfect, but they're so much better than the Republicans. They're terrible. They're terrible. Anyway, so they voted to bypass this. $13 billion in taxpayer dollars went to Sikorsky Aircraft. Now, Sikorsky Aircraft had lobbied Congress. So literally, Sikorsky had donated money to these politicians in order to have those politicians vote to give $13 billion back to Sikorsky to be able to build helicopters that the government then gave away to the Colombian military to use however they wanted, which also included murdering union organizers and social activists. So this whole thing right here with the death squads taking advantage of coronavirus to murder people in their homes, really hitting close to home. So that's something I want people to be aware of. I mean, number one, if I, felt passionately about it enough to put my own body on the line 20 years ago, I still feel passionate enough about it that this is something people need to know. And most people don't. They don't pay attention because they see... I mean, honestly, even 20 years ago, I have a couple of friends who will hear me rant about this one situation where the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force at the time, it's now the National LGBTQ Task Force, always had their annual Creating Change conference. And I remember actually trying to talk about what was happening with this action and everything, and immediately, like, as soon as I said something about Colombia, had somebody, like, interrupt me and shut me up and kind of kick me out of a meeting because of the fact that I mean, you're standing up as a white guy in the middle of a thing and talking about Colombia, and then all of a sudden people are like, you should talk about the United States, not Colombia. I was like, I was trying to talk about the United States, but you interrupted me. So, not that I hold any grudges ever, but, yeah, so this is why we have so much trouble coalescing on the left and organizing with united communities, because everybody wants to just stand up and be like, you're an asshole, rather than actually organize. So this is part of the reason why I throw up my hands and give up as often as I do. I wish I did as much activism as I used to, and I wish that I had I mean, I am still politically as radical as I ever was, but it's frustrating because as much as you don't want to base your activism on effectiveness helps to maintain energy, because, you can't keep fighting losing battles and expect to still maintain that same energy. And sustainability in any sort of political movement, but particularly a left-wing political movement, is really an issue. So I don't know what the solution is. Maybe somebody will bring up something or whatever. But anyway, so that's number one. Number two, this article was actually in The Nation, and this one was entitled "Union Busting in the Name of God." And again, I've already kind of said a few things about religion and everything else. And again, I was raised Catholic. I actually went to Catholic school my entire life. I went to Catholic grammar school in a small Catholic school. 27 people in my entire class. We were the most sheltered, naive people in the world. I went to a Catholic Jesuit prep school and a Catholic Jesuit college. Fairfield Prep and Fairfield University. So one of the things that's interesting here, so what this article in The Nation is, and again, if you have time, please read it, check it out. It's talking about, Boston College, which is one of the bigger Catholic Jesuit educational institutions out there. But there's a number of them. Georgetown and BC tend to get the most attention. The nice thing about how small Fairfield was is that whenever the Catholic Church, the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, because there's two Catholic churches in my opinion. There's lay Catholics, and then there's the hierarchy of the church, where you have the priests, bishops, monsignors, cardinals, and then the Pope. The hierarchy of the church are almost universally evil. Yes, I'm just going to go out there and say that. Almost universally evil, with some very few exceptions. But, not this current Pope, who himself, also a Jesuit, but the previous Pope, the one who resigned but is still alive, was a Hitler Youth. Woo! Hard to argue for moral superiority there. And in fact, actually, he was, before he became Pope whatever, I always still call him Ratzinger because, first of all, Ratzinger, his name and his politics go hand in hand. He was the guy who, tried to go after, Elizabeth Johnson for saying that, hey, God's beyond gender, so why don't we talk about God in female terms, too? And that was quashed. And, she was not radical at all. Just being like, let's talk about some of the female aspects of God. And, the hierarchy of the Catholic Church had to step in and knock her out. But also, he was the one who was the primary actor in trying to quash liberation theology as it developed and evolved in Latin America, which, as you can see from a lot of Latin American international politics, it was necessary and important. I lost my thing here again. Sorry. So what they've been doing, according to this Nation article, and in actuality, is that they have been trying to utilize religious exemptions, so things like the Religious Liberty Protection Act, which was something that started as a really great thing, trying to prevent discrimination against, people wearing things like a hijab or a yarmulke at work, because a lot of people get discriminated against and harassed for wearing religious cultural stuff. Except that a lot of American Christians were like, hey, we could use this to try to bypass anti-discrimination laws against gay people and try to get exemptions for allowing and accepting unions and the National Labor Relations Board processes in Catholic colleges. And that's what these colleges are trying to do right now. So there's these number of Catholic institutions that are trying to refuse to acknowledge or work with unions within their organization. I should just call them a company, because that's what they're acting like, is just an American corporation. And they're trying to use the fact that they're a Catholic institution as a means to say, hey, because of our religion, we don't need to follow the law. So what it talks about in the institution is that because of Catholic social justice teachings, that there's a lot of history with a lot of popes speaking in favor of unions in general. So it's hard to say that, because of our religion, we don't want to recognize unions, when and again, there's two Catholic churches, but at least technically the Catholic Church should be supporting unions, not busting them. So why I take this a little bit personally was because, again, at Fairfield, so to give a little bit of context personally, I went to Fairfield because my mom worked there, and she was staff, and so I was able to get tuition remission. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to afford a Fairfield education. I still could have gone to college, but it would have had to have been a college that was more affordable to us. But because I was able to get tuition free, I was able to actually attend Fairfield, and I was able to live on campus, which was important for me. And especially for my mom, because my mom was one of those people that, when she was growing up, she tried to go to college. She wanted to go to college. Her grandmother ended up sabotaging her process of trying to apply for colleges, saying that, you're just going to get married. What do you need to go to college for? So that was a big deal for my mom. And so my mom, made it kind of her life's mission to educate her children. And this is part of the reason why, for me, education is so important, because it was so important to her. And, especially now that she's no longer with us, it's kind of that thing of, that will always be a part of me, is her commitment to education. Sorry, I'm choking up a little bit. Anyway, so my mom was actually, again, she always called herself stupid, but she was not stupid. She wasn't educated, but she was actually very smart. And a lot of my class consciousness actually does come from her. And because she was the one who ended up saying, that education is the only real way to break through class barriers. mean, then I went ahead and majored in philosophy and religious studies, but no, but that was a big thing for her. And so what happened at Fairfield, which this was, I was still a senior in high school when Fairfield University did this, was that, I mean, as a general policy, if you worked directly for the university, you would get tuition remission. That included their janitorial staff, and most of their janitorial staff was Latin American. That's wonderful, because that was the way that people could, that poor people, janitorial staff could actually have their children go to Fairfield and get an education that they wouldn't have been able to afford at all otherwise. So that was a really big deal. But what Fairfield did at the time, and this was like, I think 96, 90, somewhere between 95 and 97, was they fired all of their janitorial staff and then immediately rehired them the next day through an outsourcing company, which meant that they didn't have to pay them as well. They didn't have to give them benefits at all, and that included losing out on the tuition remission. And that's important because where we're going to get later in the story is that, the good news is we were able to win a campaign and get them unionized. The bad news is the union wasn't able to get them tuition remission back or anything else. All the union was able to do was kind of protect their wages, give them collective bargaining rights, and make sure that the outsourcing companies, because they were doing a lot of shady stuff, like they would have specific people working like 10 hours at this location and 10 hours at this location, and kind of keeping everybody's hours below what they needed to be able to maximize their work output, but not have to actually give them any benefits legally. So the companies do this all the time. And again, this was like a Catholic Jesuit institution, and you could always talk about Catholic values and Catholic social justice values, and whenever people talk about religious values and we need to live by our religious values, live by those values. People only want to live religious values whenever it's stuff like, trying to justify hating Jews or black people or queers. Oh, they love to use religion against us. But if your Catholic values have to, deal with giving poor people proper compensation and taking care of the sick and the elderly and everything like that, forget that. Anyway, so this article's kind of talking about that, and it was a really big deal for me at the time, getting involved in that campaign. First of all, because I went so far as, we went through everything as students, because that was a big thing for these colleges, is that, the janitorial staff had no power themselves. It was the fact that the faculty 100% got together and fought on behalf of the janitorial staff. We got a lot of students, like myself, actively involved, and everything else. And I remember whenever Fairfield first made the decision, my mom went into a panic because that could happen to her. Now, because she's white and because she worked in the registrar's office and she was kind of a customer-facing employee, they still maintained her. She ended up being safe, but she didn't know that. And if we didn't further organize and fight back, who knows? They might have. They might have kept going with that trend. And so we fought a lot. And with any, what I loved about that was that it was one of the best implemented organization strategies that I've ever seen actually implemented from start to finish. because you start out with doing like, hey, we're going to write a nice letter to the administration and ask nicely. And then they say no. And then you escalate a little bit. And so, that's when we did petitions. And then you go from petitions to rallies. And then you go from rallies to direct action, where we ended up doing a hunger strike. Several of us actually engaged in a hunger strike on campus until the workers were able to be able to get a union, or really having a union election using the processes available. And so there's differences between the NLRB process, which is already not a perfect process. It gives way too much power to the employer and not enough power to the union or the workers. We always try to push for card check elections, which is basically you have a card, you sign it. There you go. What card check elections, what the argument against card check elections by horrible capitalists everywhere is that workers can pressure each other. We only want the company to be able to pressure and extort and exploit people and tell them all of the information about how bad unions really are. And I mean, if you work for any company, anybody who worked with me at Home Depot, whenever they had their annual "here's why unions are bad" meeting, would understand why I got as angry as I did in all those meetings, because of the fact that companies can give misinformation left and right, and nobody ever stops them. And so that's already a challenge with the NLRB process from 20 years ago, and the NLRB process has been gutted over and over and over again, and unions have been made weaker and weaker and weaker because it's harder and harder to organize a union. It's easier and easier to dissolve a union, and unions themselves have less and less actual power. So, we even did a sit-in in the president's office, and that was one of the things because my mom was terrified that I was going to get her fired, and I was convinced at one point that I was about to get expelled and she was going to get fired because of it. But it's one of those things, you put your body on the line if something matters, and that's one of the things I'm the most proud of in terms of my history, which is again why I'm doing this video today. So it's just kind of reflecting back that, the work that I was doing 20 years ago, it's like we're still not done. And not only are we still not done, but, regardless of all the fighting that we've done, we're still in a worse situation than we were 20 years ago. And I think that's important for people to understand, because everybody, thinks of politics in general as this like once every 4 years thing. We talk about politics, and we don't understand why these progressives just keep getting mad at us whenever we vote for some moderate do-nothing nobody who is willing to union bust and support these international international military aid to human rights abusers, and declaring war in Iraq despite the fact that they had absolutely nothing to do with 9/11, and all this stuff, and yet nobody ever listens, nobody ever does anything, and then they get mad that we're mad. So here we are, 20 years later. Even those of us who are willing to put our bodies on the line, and it's hard to, again, I keep talking about how I'm trying to use this as a means to get hope. You tell me. You tell me where we're supposed to get hope from this. So anyway, this is why I said, I feel like I'm being trolled by international news this week. I hope, here's the hope. I hope you all understand and spread this around and learn from it and understand why so many of us feel the way we do and why we're so passionate about our positions and why there's such a need for stronger union organizing, why there's such a need for a social safety net, why there's such a need for real dialogue about international standards, not just socialism doesn't work and we should overturn and overthrow every socialist or communist country in the world and let all the right-wing ones stay. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. It hasn't been working for 50 years. Stop. Stop doing the same thing that you've always done. It's not working. Anyway. So they're doing more organizing, and so my kind of call to action here is number one, pressure your elected officials. You know, we need to talk about Colombia. We really need to deal with that region in a way that's more complex and nuanced and actually gets to the root of the matter, again, rather than just saying right wing is good and left wing is bad. Also, especially for those of you who are Catholic, any of you who are Christian in general, take a look at these articles. Take a look at BC and everything else. Put pressure on them. Put pressure on them as Americans, as Catholics, as Christians, as citizens of the United States, as whoever you are. The universities, I think, are the most, I'm going to say, flexible. Because, the universities can change these policies, and they can support their unions, and they can start doing better tomorrow, today, everything. So get involved. Try to reach out and really push them. And hey, use Fairfield as an example. One of the things that I am actually, again, most proud of, and I don't like patting myself on the back. I don't usually bring this up, but I actually served on, our action was so successful that the university put together a panel, basically, of kind of 2 students, 2 faculty, 2 administrators to draft a policy dealing with outsourced workers, making sure that they had a right to unionize and kind of encoding it into the university policy. Now, here's where I'm going to say it wasn't nearly as successful as, we all like to say, hey, it was a victory. A university, any institution can change its policy. First of all, it doesn't have to follow its own policies. Again, it was like a recommendation policy. And they can always change those policies. So 20 years later, I don't even know if Fairfield still follows that policy or not. But, we did it. And, I was able to actually be one of the students on that panel. And I got to be the guy who, whenever administration came in with all of their, this is why unions are bad, and I laughed at them right to their face. And I don't think my professors were any more proud of me than at that moment. But no, it's just this stuff of, yes, there are corrupt unions. No, unions don't solve every single problem that workers ever had. But 100% of the time, union workers are better off than non-union workers. 100%. So that's the takeaway. It's Get on that. Get on those Catholic universities. They have no leg to stand on to try to use these religious exemptions for union busting. They have no leg to stand on religiously. They have no leg to stand on legally. And so push against them. That's a fight we can win. Let's do it. Thanks again. I hope you like and subscribe. And I hope this was informative for you, at the very least. All right.